Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Ago. And then you'll see with this talk, I know something about roads and road building. And what kind of happened with me here recently is I was asked to help out with some legislation that I'll be talking about today also at the legislature to encourage this highways for habitat policy in Minnesota. And I really think part of my professional objective in this would be just to show some reasons why the highway agencies, whether they're state or county or other local governments, why they would want beyond just our habitat or the wildlife and the why wouldn't they what business practices would be enhanced by doing a little bit different, a little bit more forward-thinking management of the roadside. So with that, let me roll on here. Let's see, here we go. So again, I mentioned, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what I know a little bit about, and I've just been really happy to already have learned just a huge amount. What I'll spend about the first half of my talk speaking about these various opportunities. And then this what's on the horizon really is the legislation that's currently being considered by the Minnesota House and Senate. And then of course, just some discussion questions, next steps at the end. So by way of various opportunities, I'll have a couple of slides with each of these. Of course, pollinator and wildlife habitat, we've heard a lot about that already. What I guess will change during my talk is I'll be talking about actual highways, some of the things we do for how do we maintain our roads across the country. The staff utilization, this is the construction maintenance staff of a highway agency. How can we optimize that staff? And then really I have one slide I'll try to explain around highway performance, how just some very important things that we do along the roadsides allows us to probably actually help the roads to last longer. So with that, let me move on here. Of course, we've seen, this slide compares not at all well to many of the ones we've seen already, but this is one of our customers, these monarch butterflies, amongst the other hundreds, thousands of insects and birds that benefit from these habitats. Here's an example of a local road, which is you can see here that the farmers are already working to restore this habitat for pollinators and small wildlife, and we've got the local road authority cooperating with that program. They've got they're only mowing just very close to the road, and they've got the rest of the ditch, the rest of the right of way is also in habitat that, again, we're not interested really in immediately trying to change every mile of every road, but we certainly already have many cooperators, and we need to have a little bit more cooperation between the public right-of-ways and the landowners, and that's what this legislation, is going to encourage in Minnesota. By way of some maintenance examples, of course, I mentioned I know a little bit about I spent about sort of 20 years working on more effective construction and maintenance of our road system. And here's just one simple example. I mean, we only have so much staff. They're all working very hard. And what we need to, when we're able to do this type of maintenance, would be, we've got a couple of culverts here. We all are familiar with culverts, either under roads, maybe we've got a rural driveway. The culverts are there for a purpose. We have to get the water away from the roads. I mean, back to I think the Roman Empire was just mentioned here in the last talk. That was these Roman roads. They were designed such that water, knowing that water was the enemy, and they would do everything in their power to keep them well drained. Well, we did build this road to be well drained, but over time, we've lost that ability, and these things need to be maintained. So we only have so much staff. When we're spending a lot of time sort of needlessly mowing, we could be doing things that would actually help the road to last longer. Here's an example. Now, this is becoming even more of a challenge as we get more and more extreme weather across the country. When you have a half-plugged culvert, the water cannot go through the culvert. It ponds up, flows over the road, and tears the road out. So this gets to be very expensive. Obviously, we need to keep the drainage going, keep the ditches drained, and so that we do not have the roads torn out. Here's just another example, and this is happening across the entire country, really, with these more and more extreme rain events. So we've got to do better. We've got to get a little more proactive on this maintenance, and we need to allocate the maintenance staff towards the most urgent needs, in my opinion, which would be preventing such catastrophic failure of our road network. Also, I mentioned, we all know we only have so much staff. We do a lot of important work at various highway agencies. We do, for instance, on the left, you see the grader, just one example of dozens and dozens of things that we need to do. This, of course, is, the highway agencies are in charge of the transportation infrastructure. That needs to be the priority, keeping the actual road surface drivable. Whether or not we need to mow the ditch all the way out to the property line seems to me not a priority when we have other important work to do. On the right side, this is just an example of some of the construction testing that highway agencies do. And when we're building projects that are worth millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, having experienced inspection personnel out there to help the contractor so that they are able to better construct the plans and specifications, this is all very important. And right now across the country, it's just a huge workforce issue to maintain the staff that we have, and to hire new people. This is just a major challenge. And again, seems like clear to me that the priority needs to be on what we're really good at, which is building stuff. And we don't need to be out here in the ditch mowing and spraying a bunch of chemicals on things that would be better in a long-term native prairie state, as was here for hundreds of years. Just sort of as I'm trying to promote this with my colleagues, I point out that, again, with this inspection, we know this for 100 years. We know that we need to do good inspection. Right now, we're really unable to do that to the degree that many of us would like. And if we can reallocate some of the staff to, again, what is known to be of a much greater value, will pay for every bucket of seed 1,000 times over if these roads last longer. So I'll just real briefly, this is kind of a lot to swallow perhaps, but let me just do my best here to explain what is this, why should you care? I guess the why you should care is because this is how your highway agencies decide how to spend money in some way or another. And so essentially the federal requirements to the states is that we have to rate our highway network in every state. So The way that's done is we essentially look at ride quality. That's over here on the left side. And every state can do this differently, but the fact of the matter is they do something like this where they have some kind of a scale of smoothness. And when the roads are smooth, they got some kind of high number, like for instance, here in Minnesota, it'd be a 4. And then we have what we'd call good. And then we have essentially fair and then poor. So every state and a whole lot of local governments do something like this. Now, what is this? Why is this important? What we do is we actually measure the smoothness of every road every year, at least in Minnesota, the trunk highways. And we plot that data. That's up here in the upper left. So the smoothness starts out smooth. We build it. It's like this was built in 2001, very smooth. Over time, the road gets less smooth, as we all know. And this sort of decay curve is based on how we built it back here in 2001. So there's some degradation of smoothness. So if doing things the way we always used to do them, this is the kind of curve we're going to keep getting. Now, if we can do things better, which is part of what I do professionally, the thought is, and we've shown this to be true, that the curve doesn't go like this. The curve does something much better, and we get more years of life. Because when this curve gets, again, the road is getting more and more rough, we get to a point, we say, we got to rebuild that road. We got to get it smooth again. Well, if we can extend this point of rebuild out however many years, in this case, just by this, sort of estimate, if it can last 10 years longer, that's a whole lot of money. And that money will pay for, like I said, about as, it'll pay for 1,000 times as many bags of seed as we're going to need. So anyway, this is just one example. We're doing way more things than trying to reallocate staff from mowing to habitat friendly practices. But this is, the math or the economics sort of points in this direction. We need to do things that are more sustainable, more resilient going forward. So I mentioned this is, sort of a brief summary. We need to optimize staff. We're always trying to remove the staff from unsafe activities, whether that be mowing or handling chemicals. And we just, basically by reducing what I'm referring to as this recreational mowing. Certainly we need to do mowing for safety reasons close to the road. We don't need to mow acres and acres, thousands of acres of road mile after mile after mile. We're not interested really in creating golf courses. We're there to maintain a highway system. So let's talk a little bit about this legislation here in Minnesota. Again, this has been under development for certainly more than 5 years. So I just kind of walk through it. If you want to, learn more about this, here the bill numbers are here. It's this House File 498 and Senate File 718. You can essentially put that into Google or get a hold of me, and I'll get you to that those bills. What they do require then is what's mentioned here, and I'm not going to read every one of these slides, but it does require the commissioner, in this case, the Commissioner of Transportation, to establish this Highways for Habitat program. And the commissioner must consult with scientists, biologists, ecologists, beyond certainly the very capable engineers to really get this right. We need the professionals to get this program established and optimized. Moving a little bit through the legislation, some of the other things that it requires. Best management practice must include guidance on seed and vegetation selection. Again, reaching out to other state agencies, other experts around what seeds and vegetation is appropriate for these roadsides. Of course, adapting to the actual roadside condition, which is not, again, is a challenge. This is all a lot of good work being already started here in Minnesota. Certainly a huge amount of work in Iowa that we can work together on. And we're also, requirement 2 here, we're going to avoid the use of pollinator lethal insecticides. 3, we have to avoid habitat destruction, of course. We're in the mode of now enhancing, not destroying the habitat for wildlife. And we're going to be optimizing where these, we're not going to start out with 15,000 miles of right of way. We've already got private ownership. We've got adjacent public ground that has appropriate habitat, and we will start with those areas along the public rights of way. I mentioned, well, the other legislation is mandated for the Commissioner of Transportation on the trunk highways. This program essentially shall be done, assuming this becomes law. Other road authorities may and are encouraged. So again, no mandate here for the local governments. That's not we're not sort of no unfunded mandates. We're going to just focus on the trunk highway system, the state highways, and again, only the areas that are, to begin with, priority habitat areas. The asset, again, the statute requires an asset management plan. Again, clearly making it clear that we're talking about the trunk highways, and the plan is to be, again, a plan, multi-year plan, describing where the priority areas are. Priority 1, 2, 3. That is the intent here, is to get a 5-year plan going. Let's think about what it's going to look like. I mean, the DOTs, we have in Minnesota, we have a 5-year plan, we have a 10-year plan, we have a 20-year plan. And so we need to get this concept embedded in the way we plan for all highways in Minnesota. A few more slides here on the details. What we're talking about is there actually are measurements that have to be done. So we're going to be increasing the restored areas, the acres along the trunk highways. We're going to be measuring and reducing the pesticides and other chemicals that are used within the rights of way, and establishing annual targets. So again, we'll have an annual expectation. We're gonna, how many acres are we going to restore each year? And of course, a lot of these things are based on available funding, but it'll be a feedback mechanism between the agency and the elected officials on how many dollars they are willing to allocate from the people of Minnesota to the establishment of better highway habitat. So when we have the population becoming more and more interested in doing the right thing, then we're going to have more resources, but we need to have a plan. Finishing up on these, the measurements, we're also going to be measuring and reducing greenhouse gases. This would be less mowing. And again, I mentioned this, the legislation requires a 5-year plan, annual investments going forward. Another important thing about this statute is that it requires collaboration with the public. So not only are we making sure that the agencies are speaking with the science professionals, they're also collaborating with the public. And the public has a role here in establishing both the measures. Right now, we proposed greenhouse gas reduction, less pesticides. If new information becomes known, and the public wants to offer at any point additional types of measures, and then additional annual performance targets, the public is involved. And I think if you look up legally what collaboration means, it doesn't mean sort of cooperate. It doesn't mean like communicate. It means collaborate. Wrapping up, there's a report then that's due to the legislature every odd number of years. Every 2 years, the department will show progress, hopefully more than less progress, but they will have to report every other year on exactly what's going on, how many acres have been restored, how much has pesticide use been reduced, how much greenhouse gas has been eliminated. that's all going to be on in black and white. So by way of some lessons learned through this process, I mean, it's sort of an area I haven't worked in as far as policy and legislation. Again, I mentioned I'm just kind of a road building guy. Certainly, this has just been an amazing collaboration. We've working with a whole bunch of associations and alliances and scientists, professionals. Really incredible what a small group can accomplish. I think that was a huge lesson learned. And I think, choice, we've talked about this quite a bit today. I think we got a whole bunch of people that are do a lot people on this call. And so that's something we all strive to do is work for a better future. And finally, sort of this call to action, we're working with the elected decision makers, both at the state level, and then also, as we can get the local governments on board, has been shown in Iowa to be, successful. Take some time, but there's certainly right now there are many local governments in Minnesota that are the voters, the citizens, the residents of those locations are certainly engaged in this process. And of course, the people that at board meetings, at the legislature, grassroots action, very good. So with that, I think I'll wrap it up here. And
thanks a lot. So this is Ken Graeve, Minnesota Department of Transportation. I work in our Office of Environmental Stewardship. This office is here to minimize the environmental impact of our work and make sure our work complies with relevant environmental requirements. My group is the Erosion and Stormwater Management Group, which includes the standards for seed mixes, planting, and in general, getting vegetation growing during a construction project. And then I also work pretty closely with our wildlife ecologists and our roadside vegetation management folks who work with the long-term maintenance of our roadsides. So making sure the roadsides are meeting the needs and the functions we have for that vegetation. And what I want to go over is just what that roadside vegetation is for. And I'm going to go through what the roadside vegetation is all about. And it's going to take a while before I get to some pollinator information. But I want to show you all the infrastructure functions that our roadside vegetation needs to serve. And then I want to explain how it actually is very fitting to include benefits to pollinators in that system. So I'm going to go through the infrastructure and then we'll talk about why that matters for pollinators. So the first thing I want to say is there's a common misconception that roadside is just extra space. And it's really a critical part of our highway infrastructure. I'm going to go through how the roadside and the vegetation on it saves lives, protects our lakes and streams, guards against alien invaders, and also provides habitat for pollinators. So first of all, you're going to hear anyone from MnDOT talk a lot about safety. Roadside vegetation needs to be managed for sightlines. So that means making sure a driver can see where they're going, see around curves, see if deer are coming from the roadside, approaching the road. So that's really important for safety in the vegetation management. The way what we plant there and how we manage that really matters for those sightlines. It also matters for clear zones. The sad truth is that the majority of single vehicle collisions with fixed objects involve trees. And so vegetation management is critical to maintaining those safe clear zones. Again, that's why we plant what we do. That's why we have to do a lot of brush control and tree removal along our roadsides, just to make sure that it's a safe environment for the speed that traffic is intended to travel at. And here's an interesting one. Although trees on roadsides can be hazards, they can also be used for safety as well. So traffic calming is any way of disrupting the feel or the experience of a roadside to make drivers slow down, usually without them even knowing about it. So if we plant trees or landscaping or narrow lanes, drivers will subconsciously slow down. And I know this from watching a road near my house here in St. Paul, where they had to take out a bunch of really big, fully grown ash trees recently. They had actually just reduced the speed limit to 25. St. Paul and Minneapolis did that recently. And then about a year later, the city foresters had to take down those ash trees. They're going to replant this spring, but right away we noticed that road was a lot harder to cross on foot. It was a lot harder to turn onto that road when driving because everyone sped up. And the only thing that changed was the trees nearby. And so we'll use trees and other vegetation for traffic calming, especially where a highway enters a town and where the speed limit it slows down. Things like that landscaping in those trees will slow down drivers a lot more effectively than the speed limit sign changing. It's pretty interesting. There are a lot of studies on that showing how that landscaping reduces overall crashes. Studies from Germany, Texas, Florida, Toronto, lots of cool information out there. Blowing snow control, that's a good thing to talk about right now. We have various ways of using vegetation to control blowing snow. We'll have tree and shrub rows as living snow fences. We'll have standing corn rows, work with farmers to leave corn standing in rows near a highway. And even things as simple as planting native grasses in the roadside. You can see in these pictures here. Same day on I-35 down by Albert Lee, on the left is a stretch of road where we planted tall, warm season native grasses. And on the right is a place where it was just our usual smooth brome. And you can see that road blowing over the highway. It doesn't look real bad where it's blowing over, but that's the kind of situation that creates blow ice. The tire tracks heat up a part of the road. And when that snow sifts over, it melts right in that tire track and creates black ice. And so something as simple as the height of the grasses we planted can really make a difference there. Soil stabilization, obviously. So the whole reason we shape our roadsides the way we do is to get water away from the road and move it on to where it needs to go. But we'd like to do that without that water taking the soil and the road with it. And that's the job of vegetation. It's really critical to stabilizing that infrastructure. Now this picture isn't eroded because we didn't have vegetation. This is from a pretty major flood down in southeast Minnesota in 2007, but it kind of is an interesting visual of what can happen. This next picture is actually from lack of vegetation. The vegetation was killed off because of some improper herbicide use. And you can see how that structure is eroding, how the soil is eroding and building up, which can cause flooding. That structure, just the structure itself being exposed, is a hazard if a car were to come off the road and hit that. But then the flooding is probably an even bigger hazard if it were to flood that road and create hydroplaning or icing. So vegetation just doing its job in a way that no one ever notices until it's gone, and then we start to notice. Stormwater management, another major function of roadside vegetation. I'm sure a lot of people here have been through the Lowry Tunnel in Minneapolis. And if you ever go through there, maybe you've noticed. If you haven't noticed, look next time at the walls in that tunnel. They're almost always black with grime. Those get washed off twice a year. The rinsate water, the wash water that comes off of those walls is regulated waste. We can't dump that down the drain. We have to take it somewhere to get treated. We pay money to dispose of it. The reason that matters for roadside vegetation is because right there in that tunnel, that very tiny stretch of our state highway system, you can actually see all the pollutants. In all the other 11,999 miles of state roadside, the only thing there to collect those pollutants and hopefully clean it up is the roadside vegetation and the soil bacteria that vegetation supports. Florida DOT did a study of ecosystem services of roadside vegetation several years ago. Using an EPA stormwater calculator, they valued the runoff reduction of Florida roadsides at $465 million a year. So almost $500 million a year. Several years ago now, they have about half as many state highway miles as Minnesota. So there's some serious benefit in that roadside vegetation out there on that roadside. We can't talk about a roadside without talking about invasive species. I can't. Invasive species, they're a big deal. They cause dozens of billions of dollars worth of damage to agriculture and forestry in the United States every year. They cause problems directly to roadsides, in addition to ecological and agricultural problems all across our lives. Various problems to roadsides themselves. You can see here some serious structural problems, some safety problems where a driver can't see those signs. Damaging pavement, retarding drainage, which can further damage pavement. And as many of you probably know, roadsides are part of the problem, or roads are part of the problem of invasive species spread. Weeds spread along the road by some of our own work, mowing, shouldering, ditch cleanouts, culvert repairs. Roadsides are really good habitat for a lot of invasive species because of the frequent disturbance, the edge effect, the altered hydrology, the salt. And since we're spreading those species along, the roadside connects vulnerable sites across what otherwise would be inhospitable habitats. So maybe there's a wet tolerant weed. It's not going to move very easily across uplands to get to the next wetland, but with a roadside, it can move. And it's a serious problem and something that our roadside management really needs to always be mindful of. Although we can be part of the problem, we can also be part of the solution, because roadsides represent that altered environment, that disturbed environment that a lot of invasive species can really use. They're often one of the first places an invasive species is going to show up and start spreading. And so roadsides, if we have roadside managers who are watching that vegetation and keeping their eyes out, roadsides can be a first line of defense against new invasive species. A couple examples, MnDOT was one of the first to notice and sound the alarm about cutleaf teasel in Minnesota. This is a case where we noticed the plant, which is really problematic in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois. If you drive through there, you'll see carpets of teasel. We noticed it at a roadside and started investigating and determined that it most likely came from a bouquet left at a grave at the cemetery nearby. It's really common in cut flower arrangements and dried flower arrangements. Got to the roadside and then started spreading. Luckily, we were able to notice that spread soon and start efforts to control it. Another example is Oriental bittersweet. This is a pretty hard-hitting vine that we noticed on a roadside. And again, we're one of the first to sound the alarm about Oriental bittersweet. Got Department of Agriculture involved, and before long, it got listed on the Minnesota noxious weed list to help generate support and leverage some funds to control it on public and private lands where it was present in Minnesota. So invasive species, again, serious concern. Roadsides can be part of the problem and can also be an important part of the solution. Aesthetics. Roadsides are kind of the front step, the curb appeal for Minnesota. And the reason that matters is because of tourism being so important in Minnesota. My data is a few years old, but well, these are 2013 numbers showing that almost a fifth of state sales tax revenues were from tourism dollars. And the reason roadsides matter in that is because most of a person's experience in being a tourist in Minnesota is going to involve what they see out the window of their car, for better or worse. And we want to make sure they have a good first impression of what they see so that they're likely to come back and further support that industry and that economy of Minnesota. So the way it looks really matters. Vegetation is a really key part of that. Health, this is the part where another part where trees can save lives. A lot of you may have heard of studies of greenery, natural areas, vegetation, reducing stress. There's a well-known study showing that hospital patients recovered faster and used less medication when they had a hospital room with a view of a natural setting than patients without a room. There was another study that kind of built upon that to study roadside vegetation, and they found that people commuting along roadsides with naturalized vegetation had a reduced stress response at that time, and also a reduced stress response later in the day, meaning that natural vegetation, that experience of natural vegetation on their way to work made them better able to handle stressful tasks later on during their workday, which is just fascinating. Really important socioeconomic impacts with roadside vegetation, particularly in urban areas. And this relates to various studies showing that visitors to well-landscaped or forested, as an urban forest, business districts are willing to spend more time, willing to spend more money, actually willing to pay more for parking in neighborhoods with nice landscaping, shade trees than otherwise. There are studies that show that urban trees increase property values, decrease crime rates, etc. Resiliency. We need to make sure our roadside vegetation is designed and managed for resiliency. Here's a photo from the drought of 2021, actually taken on a day with some clouds and a little drizzle, even though it was in severe drought. Where it's brown, it is smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass, non-native species. The green bunches are warm season native grasses. And you can even see in the middle of the foreground, a few thistle plants that are starting to capitalize on the weakened non-native vegetation. So being able to have vegetation that can handle these weather extremes is really important in making sure that it can fulfill all those functions I talked about previously. Now let's move on to some of the added benefits. One, as you all know, is biodiversity. And there are some really interesting statistics here. So here is a picture of a remnant prairie along a roadside, as is typical. It's in between a highway and a railroad. And here's a picture of Sullivan's milkweed, prairie milkweed. There's one county in Southwest Minnesota where the only known population of this species, which is a state threatened plant, is in a highway roadside and the adjacent railroad right-of-way. That right-of-way is now owned by DNR, which is good. So pretty rare, but happens to have taken refuge in a roadside. Similarly with the Western Prairie Fringed orchid, a federally threatened species. One of the biggest populations in the state, up in Northwest Minnesota, is on state highway right-of-way. Down in Southeast Minnesota, there are only two known populations. One is on a state highway roadside, and one is on an abandoned railroad grade that, again, is owned by DNR. And then prairie shooting star. It's an endangered species in Minnesota. There are only two known locations in the entire state. One is on a state roadside, and one is on an old railroad grade that's now owned by DNR. So, our roadsides have inherited these remnants, and we consider it part of our public trust that we also are good stewards of them. You all know about the habitat benefits. They're important. Roadsides can be important corridors for wildlife. They can be the only remaining habitat in some intensively farmed areas, where we're not using a lot of regenerative agriculture, like Jonathan talked about. Lots of species rely on it. The composition of the vegetation really matters, though. I saw some questions in the chat asking about this, and maybe there are others who can vouch for or correct some of my data. So there are studies that show that pollinator diversity on roadsides increases with forb diversity. Abundance also increases with forb diversity. Some of the habitat specialist insect species increase with forb diversity. There are twice as many habitats as a butterfly species on roadsides with native grasses and forbs than on brome roadsides. 5 times more butterfly individuals on native roadsides. Higher bee richness and abundance. Some findings that show that the width and the speed and the traffic volume don't seem to have a significant influence on bee and monarch populations. They suggest that the cars do kill some of them, but that the proportional death rate from cars is pretty small in comparison to the death rate from natural mortality, predators, parasitoids, etc. So kind of interesting. So there's always the source and sink debate in ecology, and at least some of the research seems to suggest that that roadside is more of a source than a sink, despite the concerns. If there's newer research, I'd be happy to learn about it too. But that's what I had found last time I looked into it. So now this is where we get to what I talked about at the beginning. Our seed mixes are designed. So this is what the contractors plant toward the end of our construction projects. And they're designed to make sure that our roadsides are providing all those critical functions that I talked about earlier: safety, stabilization, stormwater management, invasive species prevention, etc. And in designing those to meet those needs, we use the ecological principle that local adaptation and diversity will increase function and resilience. It turns out that means native vegetation, lots of species of native vegetation, which also yields ecological benefits such as habitat for pollinators. So I'm just going to go quickly through a few examples. So here's a roadside in Southwest Minnesota, right on I-90 by Blue Earth, Minnesota, actually by Gookeen, if anyone knows Gookeen. All of our native seed mixes have a variety of functional groups to make sure they're serving those ecological functions for a functional roadside vegetation. So we've got cool season grasses to provide quick establishment from disturbance and initial planting, early season cover. We have warm season grasses that have deep roots for soil stabilization and infiltration. They're also drought and salt tolerant to withstand the harsh roadside conditions. Turns out that bunch grasses also leave space for ground nesting bees. So there's a one side benefit to designing this way. We try to have a lot of legumes in our roadside mixes for nitrogen fixation to maintain soil fertility so that that roadside can be more self-sufficient. It turns out a lot of native legumes are a good forage source for pollinators. We have a variety of forbs in all of our mixes. Some, like these black-eyed Susans, are quick to recolonize after a disturbance. We've got others such as milkweed, blue vervain here. In general, they're there to diversify the root zone, which improves soil structure, and stabilization improves infiltration. Just a variety of groups of forbs also occupies various niches that could otherwise be used by different invasive species. And then we just have diversity within each functional group. So if we have warm season grasses in the mix, we have a few of them. And cool season grasses, we have a few species. Same with forbs in the aster family and legume family and various other families. We try to make sure everything is redundant, which increases resiliency. And as you all might have guessed, a side benefit there is it diversifies habitat and provides better season-long forage for pollinators. So again, we're designing for those functions, those critical functions we need to perform that I talked about in the beginning. But in doing that, we have to use ecological principles to make it work well, which means we're going to have pollinator benefits as well. Just a few quick updates. So we are updating our seed mixes right now. If you're familiar with MnDOT seed mixes, they are part of the same list that Bowser uses. We are going to be changing that. We're updating them for faster establishment, which is a key pressure from our construction projects. More legumes, just to improve soil health, soil structure, soil quality, and nutrient quality are usually really poor on our post-construction soils. We're still going to be using source identified seed, so seed with Minnesota origins, but they're going to be roadside specific. They won't look much like what someone used to doing ecological restoration plantings in a crop field is used to seeing. They are going to be distinct from Bowser seed mixes. These three photos are of a trial of one of the mixes where we're using far more cool season grasses than you typically see in a conservation planting. The top photo is 2 weeks after planting, which is some extreme green up for a native seed mix. The concern is that it's too fast and those cool season grasses are going to crowd out, prevent long-term diversity. I was nervous when I saw it. The second photo is a couple months after planting. In the top there, down in the bottom is older yet, and some things have started to senesce. This picture was taken in October, so there's some senescence going on there. Plants drying out at the end of the year. So 2 weeks, 2 months, but then the bottom photo shows a nice mix of warm season bunch grasses, a handful of forbs. That's taken 2 years later. And so it's promising, showing that we can, at least in some soil types, we can have fast establishment, yet still have that long-term diversity, which is really encouraging. And then just a few updates about what we're doing with roadside vegetation in general at MnDOT. So we have a sustainability goal to plant 75% of our seeding with native species by 2025. Currently, we're at about 61%. Based on 2021 data. I don't have 2022 numbers in yet. We have a goal of to increase the native proportion of our landscape plantings, so trees and shrubs that we do in more of a formal setting. Right now we're about 50%, but aiming for 80 to 90%, depending on if it's urban or rural. We are working on special vegetation management plans for corridors that usually have high quality roadside prairie remnants, or for one reason or another are home to rare protected species. We've developed a pretty robust roadside fire program, and we're using that where we have native vegetation. First priority is for roadsides with remnant prairie, but probably most of it is used on roadsides where we have planted native vegetation. And we see that as a really important tool to reliably managing the native vegetation that we have. We have 5 fire crews. They burn about 85 miles a year on average. That's from the past 2 years. That's really a huge number. Everything on the roadside is harder because we have to do traffic control because it's linear. There's so much edge. The fact that they've been able to achieve that kind of production is pretty amazing. Since I'm talking to folks about pollinators, I mentioned fire, I need to mention refugia. We do burn in ways that leave some vegetation undisturbed, where we're working on roadside prairie remnants. Usually they're up against the railroad and there's often native vegetation on the other side of the tracks that we don't touch. We move pretty quickly when we burn, which means there are lots of skips. And so there are patches where the vegetation is unburned. And we have a wildlife ecologist in our office who is well-versed in entomology and their habitat needs and the impacts of fire. And so we consult with him on whether our fire program is doing the right thing or not in terms of insects. And one last thing, not quite vegetation related, but I just thought this group might be interested. We're taking efforts to reduce the amount of plastic, single-use plastic that we use on our roadsides in erosion control and sediment control. Plastic netting and blanket is one of the most widely known examples. It can trap wildlife. It's a pain in the butt to walk through. It eventually falls apart and becomes microplastics. We used to install about 300 acres a year of plastic netting through our construction program, most of which is never removed because it's just not the way it's designed. As of 2020, we're installing 0 acres per year. erosion control blanket with plastic netting. We use natural netting now on all of it. The picture of the funny equipment in the bottom is some machinery being used to try to figure out hemp production, how to take hemp and produce the fibers and the yarns to make erosion control and sediment control products with a locally produced crop rather than plastic or the fibers, which in some cases are shipped from the other side of the world. And so that's been really interesting to see how that can work. I think it's an industry that's really going to take off. And then also that last one, there's this green dye. Whenever you see roadsides planted, where often you see it sprayed with this bluish or bluish green substance, sometimes green. Our toxicologist noticed several years ago that the green dye that they were using is toxic to aquatic life. And so we prohibited that starting in 2014. We're the only state, as far as I know, that has prohibited that green dye. It was kind of a fight with industry, but that's why on a road project, you should be seeing blue dye instead of green dye. And that's because we've prohibited that. Just about done, a lot of information out there. These are some resources that you can go to. These are links, and if there's a way to share the slideshow, there will be links in it, but you can also just do an internet search for any of these terms and find more information on the things that I've talked about right there. My next slide is questions, but I'm going to go back to the resources slide in case any of you are taking notes.